How's it going, everybody? Welcome to today's video. Today, I wanted to discuss the nuances of shoulder mobility training. Granted, when it comes to mobility training as a general, a lot of the positional awareness makes a significant difference. For example, if you're doing lower body mobility, it's really good to have good awareness of what your lumbar spine and your entire spine is doing, rather than just trying to go through the movement overall. Now, when it comes to the shoulders, it's important to consider the relationship between the glenohumeral joint and the shoulder blade. Oftentimes, we'll find that the shoulder blade is compensating or making up for a lack of movement in the glenohumeral joint. For example, if it comes to external rotation, what we'll find is that the shoulder blade starts to typically retract as people start to get further out into external rotation. This starts to take away from the tissues that we're trying to target and train. So I'm going to go through some different checkpoints and different things to keep in mind as you're going through your shoulder mobility training in order to get the most effect out of it. I'll catch y'all in a little bit. While you're familiar with the external rotation drill, what I want you to think about as you're doing this is setting your shoulder blade up into a anterior tilt position, meaning that shoulder blade is going to kind of roll forward and elevate just a little bit. When we do this, this puts our shoulder blade in a position where it's typically not going to be retracted, meaning we take away those compensation patterns. It's really hard to keep that position, but this is something to really focus on. Now you're going to notice here in a second, I'm going to actually put my shoulder blade in a little bit more of a neutral position. And what ends up happening is I get a lot of retraction from that shoulder blade. This is not going to hit the infraspinatus or the external rotators of that glenohumeral joint. Also, take your time with these drills, making sure that you're keeping your shoulder in a good position, going slow, keeping things controlled so resistance is going. Now, when it comes to internal rotation, we want to sit the shoulder blade down or depress the shoulder blade. Now, with this one, we're working the subscap, but this is a really good way to work on that internal rotation. You're going to see in a second that I'm actually going to not pull my shoulder blade down, and instead, my shoulder blade is going to retract. Reminder, in order to keep those muscles from getting involved, we have to sit our shoulder blade into a depressed position in order to facilitate the greatest activation. Now, here's for the serratus. I love this drill, but the positioning makes the difference. A little bit of spinal flexion in the thoracic spine, protracting that shoulder blade, and as you're bringing that hand up overhead, allowing the shoulder blade to upwardly rotate. That is what facilitates a greater serratus anterior activation, but this will also help with strengthening the tissues that are in charge of overhead mobility. This is a drill to do before doing any kind of overhead presses, but this is also a really good drill to work on some of those weak points serratus tends up. This next drill here, we're going to be working on shoulder flexion. Now, what's really important is that we're dropping the rib cage down into the bench. My feet are on the bench to also maintain keeping my lower back on the bench as well. So almost keeping a very flat back in order to keep the lower back from getting involved. Now, you don't want to protract the shoulder blade or retract it, but instead, as you're moving into that overhead position, you want to maintain keeping the rib cage down. You can only go so far, and that's completely okay, but over time, you'll notice that your range of motion starts to increase. Now, in the next regression here, we can actually assist bringing the arm back up, which will oftentimes be very helpful for most people. This drill is something you should do with light weight. I'm using 8 pounds in this video, but starting off with 3 or 5, specifically if you have shoulder flexion issues, will be a really, really good way to start at. Slow and controlled. Pause at the bottom there for a second, making sure you're controlling your breathing is going to make all the difference for this particular drill here. When it comes to lower trap engagement, a lot of people would tend to get too caught up in trying to lock the shoulder blade into a particular position And instead of thinking about how to lock the shoulder blade into a particular position, allow upward rotation of that shoulder blade. Again, this is one of those drills that's going to help improve your overhead mobility. But making sure we're doing this correctly makes all the difference. You'll also notice that I have a neutral spine. Try to keep that neutral spine the entire time and focus on your control throughout that drill. This last drill here is that external rotation. If you look at my shoulder blade on the right, there's very, very minimal movement. When we start to get too much movement in a shoulder blade, we start to take away from those rotator cuff tissues. So locking that shoulder blade into a depressed position will be very helpful with facilitating greater activation on those external rotators, but also getting a really good internal rotation stretch. I hope that was helpful. Thank you for joining me for today's video, everybody. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please don't be afraid to let me know in the comment section down below. But I'll be sure to catch you on the next one. Have a good one.